In the forest and highlands of colonial Kenya, a struggle unfolded that would help shape the country's path to independence. At the center of that struggle was Dedan Kimathi, one of the best-known leaders of the Mau Mau movement. To many Africans, he became a symbol of resistance against colonial rule. To the British colonial government, he was the leader of an armed rebellion that had to be defeated. But this is not only the story of one man. It is the story of farmers whose land had changed hands. Families divided by conflict. Villages caught between competing loyalties. And ordinary people forced to make difficult choices during one of the most turbulent periods in Kenya's history. The Mau Mau Uprising was more than a war fought in the forest. It grew from years of land dispossession, political exclusion, and demands for freedom. Its effects reached far beyond the battlefield, touching homes, communities, and generations of Kenyans. To understand Dedan Kimathi, we must first understand the war that existed before the fighting began. Because before there were soldiers in the forest, there were farmers in the fields. Before there was rebellion, there was ordinary life. Chapter 1. Before the forest. Long before the forest became known for war, they were simply part of the land. In the early morning, mist rested on the hills of central Kenya. Smoke drifted from cooking fires as families prepared the first meal of the day. Children walked along narrow footpaths. Farmers stepped into their fields before the heat settled over the valleys. For many Kikuyu families, the land was more than soil beneath their feet. It provided food, marked the resting places of ancestors, and carried memories from one generation to the next. The seasons decided the pace of life. There was a time to plant, a time to weed, and a time to harvest. The work was hard, but it was familiar. Villages moved to this steady rhythm. Neighbors gathered to help one another when the work was too much for a single family. Elders listened to disagreements and searched for peaceful ways to settle them. When evening came, people returned home before darkness covered the hills. Stories were shared beside the fire while another day quietly came to an end. Beyond the villages, however, another rhythm was taking shape. Kenya had been under British colonial rule for many years. During that time, control of land changed in ways that touched countless African families. Large areas of fertile farmland were reserved for European settlers, while many Kikuyu communities found themselves living on smaller plots than before. For families whose lives depended on the land, these changes reached far beyond the boundaries of a field. Many men traveled away from home to earn wages on settler farms or in growing towns. Taxes often had to be paid with money instead of crops, making paid work a necessity for many households. Families adjusted as best they could. Some managed to hold on to what they had. Others found each season becoming a little more difficult than the last. From one day to the next, life still appeared much the same. Markets filled with people buying and selling food. Children laughed as they chased one another along dusty paths. Livestock grazed across the hills. Weddings, funerals, and harvests continued as they always had. To someone passing through, it might have seemed that nothing important was changing. But history often moves quietly before anyone gives it a name. The small changes began to gather. A family worked land that no longer felt secure. A father spent more time away from home searching for wages. Conversations that once centered on rain and harvest slowly turned toward land, laws, and the future. No single day announced that life had entered a different chapter. The change came one season at a time. Among the many young men living through those years was Dedan Kimathi. At the time, he was not widely known across Kenya. He had worked in different jobs, received an education, and, like many others of his generation, was trying to find his place in a country that was changing around him. His name carried little meaning beyond the people who already knew him. That would not last. In the years ahead, the forest that had watched over generations of quiet mornings would become places of hiding, survival, and resistance. The lives of ordinary families would be pulled into a conflict that would change Kenya forever. And one man, whose name was still unfamiliar to most, would become impossible to separate from that story. Chapter 2. The land begins to change. The first signs did not arrive all at once. They came slowly, almost quietly, until they became impossible to ignore. Families who had worked the same land for generations found themselves with less room to farm. As children grew into adults, there was less land to divide among them. Some left home to look for work. Others stayed, hoping the next season would somehow be better than the last. Across central Kenya, more African men and women worked on farms they did not own. They planted crops, built fences, and cared for livestock on land that had once been part of the world their parents remembered differently. The work brought wages, but it also reminded many people of what had changed. British colonial rule reached beyond the fields. New laws shaped where people could live, work, and travel. Taxes, identity documents, and government regulations became part of everyday life. For many families, these were no longer distant decisions made by officials. They were realities that touched ordinary days. Some chose to speak through petitions and political organizations, hoping their concerns would be heard. Community leaders called for greater African representation and for land rights to be addressed through peaceful means. Many believed change was still possible without violence. But as the years passed, frustration grew. Meetings that once focused on local concerns began to carry heavier conversations. People spoke more often about land, fairness, and the future their children might inherit. These discussions took place in homes, in marketplaces, and beneath the shade of trees where neighbors gathered. They were not always loud, but they became harder to avoid. It was during these years that Dedan Kimathi became more deeply involved in political organizing among the Kikuyu. He joined others who believed that the loss of land and political rights could no longer be ignored. Like many activists of the time, he worked within growing networks that challenged colonial authority, even as the risks became greater. The colonial government also saw the growing tension. Officials increased surveillance of political groups and watched closely as support for African nationalist movements spread. Trust began to fade between communities and the government that ruled them. For ordinary families, uncertainty settled over daily life. Parents still planted crops. Children still walked to school. Markets still opened with the rising sun. Yet beneath these familiar routines was a question that no harvest could answer. How long could life continue this way? Soon, some would decide that words were no longer enough. They would leave their homes and disappear into the forest. There, the struggle would take a new and far more dangerous shape. Chapter 3. Into the forest. By the early 1950s, the feeling that something had to change had spread across much of central Kenya. For some, peaceful appeals no longer seemed to bring results. A growing number of men and women made a choice that would separate them from their homes, their families, and the lives they had always known. They left for the forest. The forest of the Aberdares and the slopes of Mount Kenya became more than places of tall trees and quiet rivers. Hidden beneath their thick canopy were small camps where fighters lived with very little. They slept on the ground, moved often to avoid detection, and depended on trusted supporters who quietly carried food, clothing, and information through dangerous paths. The movement that came to be known as the Mau Mau drew support mainly from the Kikuyu, along with members of the Mbu and Meru communities. It was not a single army with one command. Different groups operated across the forest and the countryside, connected by a shared goal of ending colonial rule and reclaiming land they believed had been taken from them. As the movement grew, so did the need for leadership. Among those who emerged was Dedan Kimathi. Over time, he became one of the best-known field commanders of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, the armed wing of the Mau Mau movement. Fighters looked to him for direction, while the colonial government came to see him as one of the rebellion's most important leaders. Life in the forest demanded constant movement. Camps could not remain in one place for long. Smoke from a cooking fire or footprints in the mud could reveal a hiding place. Food was often scarce, and every journey carried the risk of capture or death. Survival depended on discipline, secrecy, and the support of people living beyond the forest edge. Outside the forest, ordinary families found themselves caught between two dangerous worlds. Some secretly supplied food, medicine, or messages to the fighters. Others feared the consequences if they were discovered. Many had little real choice. A visit from the forest at night or a visit from colonial security forces during the day could place the same family under suspicion from both sides. In October 1952, the colonial government declared a state of emergency across Kenya. Thousands of soldiers, police officers, and home guard units were mobilized. Mass arrests followed, and many political leaders were detained. The conflict that had been growing in the shadows was now out in the open. The forest grew quieter, but the silence hid constant movement. Patrols searched valleys and mountain trails. Fighters changed camps before dawn. Villages lived under increasing restrictions as checkpoints, searches, and curfews became part of everyday life. The distance between ordinary life and war grew smaller with each passing week. Before long, the struggle would reach nearly every corner of central Kenya. The forest could no longer contain it. And neither could the people whose lives had already been changed forever. Chapter 4. The Emergency. The emergency changed the sound of everyday life. The roads filled with military convoys. Armed patrols moved through villages at first light. Checkpoints appeared along familiar paths where neighbors had once greeted one another without fear. Curfews emptied the roads before nightfall, and silence became another sign that life had changed. For many families, each day began with uncertainty. A knock at the door before sunrise could mean a search. A journey to the market could end in questioning. People learned to carry identification, follow new roles, and live with the knowledge that ordinary routines were now watched closely. Across central Kenya, the colonial government expanded its campaign against the Mau Mau. Thousands of people were arrested on suspicion of supporting the movement. Detention camps were established. And many detainees were held without trial under emergency regulations. At the same time, large numbers of villagers were moved into fortified settlements, often called emergency villages, where movement could be more easily controlled. The forest remained the center of the armed struggle. There, Mau Mau fighters continued to move through the mountains, avoiding military patrols and searching for food wherever they could find it. The forest offered cover, but they could not provide everything needed to survive. As security operations tightened, supplies became harder to obtain, and every journey carried greater danger than the last. Dedan Kimathi remained one of the most recognized leaders still fighting in the forest. The colonial government placed a large reward on information leading to his capture and distributed his photograph across the country. His name became known far beyond the mountain trails where he lived, representing both a determined resistance and a growing target for colonial security forces. The conflict left deep scars on every side. Civilians were killed. Members of the security forces lost their lives. Mau Mau fighters died in battles, ambushes, and military operations. Families were separated for months or years, never certain when, or if, they would see one another again. The cost of the war was measured not only in lives lost, but also in homes abandoned, fields left untended, and communities divided by fear. As the years passed, the number of fighters in the forest began to fall. Constant military operations, shortages of food, and the loss of trusted supply networks made survival increasingly difficult. The struggle that had once seemed to be growing was becoming harder to sustain. Then, on October 21, 1956, the search reached its turning point. During a security operation in the Nyeri district, Dedan Kimathi was captured after being wounded. For the colonial government, it was one of the most significant victories of the emergency. News of his capture spread quickly across Kenya, reaching villages, towns, detention camps, and military posts alike. The fighting did not end that day, but many understood that the war had entered a different chapter. One of its most recognizable leaders was no longer in the forest, and the question that remained was no longer whether he had been captured. It was what would happen next. Chapter 5. Trial and Execution. When Dedan Kimathi was captured, the news traveled quickly, but not always clearly. In villages across central Kenya, people heard different versions of the same story. Some learned of it from government announcements. Others heard it from travelers, relatives, or neighbors. However the news arrived, it carried the same message. One of the most recognized leaders of the forest had been taken alive. Kimathi was brought before a colonial court in Nairobi. He was charged with possessing a firearm and ammunition without lawful authority, an offense that carried the death penalty under the emergency regulations. The trial was held in November 1956. Kimathi was found guilty, and the court sentenced him to death. His lawyers appealed the conviction, but the appeal was unsuccessful. The sentence remained in place. On February 18, 1957, Dedan Kimathi was executed by hanging at Kimathi prison. The colonial government buried his body in an unmarked grave. His burial place was not revealed. And for many years, his family did not know where he had been laid to rest. That absence became part of the story itself. There was no public funeral, no place where loved ones could gather, and no grave that marked the end of his life. His execution did not end the emergency overnight. Some Mau Mau fighters remained in the forest. Security operations continued, and many families were still living under restrictions, detention, or forced resettlement. Yet for many people, Kimathi's death marked the close of an important chapter in the armed struggle. A man whose name had come to symbolize resistance was gone, but the questions that had given rise to the conflict remained. Across Kenya, families continued to live with loss. Some mourned relatives who had died in the forest. Others waited for family members held in detention camps. Some returned to homes that had changed during years of conflict. Others never returned at all. The emergency had left its mark on nearly every community it touched. History would continue to debate the Mau Mau Uprising, its methods, its divisions, and its cost. But no debate could erase what ordinary people had lived through. They remembered the empty places at family gatherings, the fields left behind, the years shaped by fear, the hope that one day life might return to something they once recognized. Dedan Kimathi did not live to see Kenya become independent. But the struggle he became part of had already changed the course of the country's history. The emergency would eventually come to an end. Colonial rule would also come to an end. What remained was the difficult task of remembering a past that carried both pain and purpose. And as Kenya moved toward a new future, the story of Dedan Kimathi would begin another life. Not in the forest where he fought, but in the memories of the nation he never saw become free. Chapter 6. What remains? When the fighting ended, the silence did not erase the past. The forests were still there. The footpaths still crossed the hills of central Kenya. Farmers returned to their fields, children walked to school, and families began rebuilding lives that had been shaped by years of conflict. But for many, the emergency had left memories that could not be measured by the passing of time. Kenya gained its independence from Britain on December 12, 1963. For many citizens, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. The country now faced a different challenge. Not how to win freedom, but how to build a nation after years of division, loss, and sacrifice. The story of the Mau Mau did not end with independence. For many years, the movement received limited public recognition, and the experiences of many former fighters, detainees, and affected families remained largely absent from official national memory. Yet within homes and communities, their stories continued to be told. Parents spoke to their children. Elders remembered those who never returned. The past survived because people carried it with them. The memory of Dedan Kimathi changed over time as well. To the colonial government during the emergency, he had been one of the most wanted leaders of an armed rebellion. To many Kenyans, he came to be remembered as a symbol of resistance against colonial rule. Historians continue to study his life, the Mau Mau movement, and the difficult choices made during those years, drawing on documents, testimony, and evidence to better understand a conflict that shaped modern Kenya. In 2003, the Kenyan government lifted the colonial-era ban on the Mau Mau movement. 4 years later, a statue of Dedan Kimathi was unveiled in the center of Nairobi. It stands not as a complete answer to history, but as a reminder that the meaning of the past can change as new generations ask new questions. The search for truth has continued beyond monuments. Former detainees and their families spent decades seeking recognition for what they endured during the emergency. In 2013, the British government expressed regret for the abuses suffered by Kenyan detainees and agreed to compensate more than 5,000 survivors who had brought a legal case. The settlement did not erase the pain of the past, but it acknowledged that many had endured serious mistreatment during colonial detention. Today, the forests where fighters once hid are quiet again. Visitors can walk beneath the same trees without hearing the sounds of patrols or distant gunfire. The hills remain much as they were before the conflict, reminding us that landscapes often outlive the struggles of those who passed through them. History is often remembered through famous names, but it is carried by ordinary people. It lives in families who remember loved ones they lost. It lives in communities that rebuilt after years of hardship. It lives in the stories passed from one generation to the next, even when no photographs were taken and no monuments were raised. Dedan Kimathi was one man in a much larger story. To understand his life is to look beyond the battlefield and see the farmers who worked on certain land, the children who grew up during the emergency, the families separated by war, and the communities that carried those memories into an independent Kenya. That is what remains. Not only the memory of one man, but the lives of countless people whose experiences became part of the history of a nation. And perhaps that is the quiet work of history itself. To remember not only how people fought, but how they lived. This is the African Archive. If this story matters to you, subscribe. And join us as we uncover the next chapter of Africa's remarkable past. The archive is never closed. We'll see you in the next story.